Have you ever felt something following you that you couldn't name? Not a shadow. Not a sound you could pinpoint. Something older than that. Something that knew you before you knew yourself, and had been waiting, patient as stone, for the moment you finally slowed down enough to feel it at your back. That question used to live in the marrow of a man named Elias Vane, though he would have never put it that way. He was not the kind of man who spoke about marrow, or about waiting things, or about the strange geometry of dread that can stretch itself across a peaceful afternoon and still somehow feel like it belongs there. He was the kind of man who kept his hands busy, who chose silence not because he was at peace with it, but because he had long ago decided that the alternative, the speaking, the naming, the turning around, was simply too expensive. He had ridden this meadow path every October for 11 years. The same pale grass, the same long ribbon of sky bruising at its edges into something between violet and sorrow. The same horse, too, for the first 6 of those years, a bay mare named Clara, after no one he'd admit to, and then, after Clara, a gray gelding he'd bought without sentiment and named simply the horse in his head, though the stable hands had taken to calling him Milo and Elias had quietly stopped correcting them. The ride was his ritual, his one permitted softness. 40 minutes out across the open land behind the old Vane property, a property he'd inherited and hadn't sold only because selling it would have required making a decision about what he wanted, and Elias Vane had been carefully avoiding that particular question for most of his adult life. He would ride until the tree line, pause for exactly as long as it took to feel the wind shift, and then turn back. He had not once deviated from this, until the evening of October 9th. The air had that quality it gets in the dying weeks of autumn, almost edible, thick with the smell of cold soil and the ghost of something that had been growing all summer and was now in the slow, dignified process of returning to the dark. Elias rode with his grip loose and his mind already somewhere ahead of him, in the blankness he'd learned to produce on command, the way a practiced drinker can make themselves feel the warmth before the glass is empty. He wasn't thinking about his father's letter. He was specifically, deliberately, not thinking about it. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, forwarded from his city address, written in his father's handwriting, a handwriting he recognized before he even read the name on the return address, a handwriting that still had the ability to make his stomach drop like a stone through water. He had placed it on the kitchen counter unopened. He had moved it twice. It sat now on the small table near the back door, still sealed, accumulating the specific weight that unopened things collect when they contain something you already know but have not yet allowed yourself to know. Elias was not thinking about the letter. He was watching the last light flatten itself across the grass when Milo's ears moved. It was a small thing. A horse's ears are always moving, reading the wind, scanning the frequency of the world for information too fine for human senses. But there is a specific quality to the movement when the ears swivel backward and lock. It is different from idle curiosity. It has intent. It has the look of something heard and not yet understood, something the animal is holding in its attention the way you hold a name on the tip of your tongue. Elias noticed it the way he noticed most things, peripherally, with one layer of himself while another layer kept carefully not thinking. He assumed it was the sound of Milo's own tail. He assumed it was a pheasant in the grass, or the distant crack of a branch settling in the cold. He assumed it was something explicable, and he was very good at assuming things were explicable. Then Milo began to move faster without being asked. Not a surge. Not a spook. Something more considered and somehow more frightening than a spook, but deliberate acceleration, a gathering of speed that had the quality of decision rather than panic. Elias felt it in his thighs and calves, the shift in the horse's rhythm, a step up in urgency the way a person walking through a parking garage at night will suddenly find themselves walking faster without knowing when they decided to. He closed his legs and lifted the reins. Milo slowed fractionally, reluctantly, the way a man being pulled back from a window by a friend will slow but keep his eyes on the glass. And then, With a motion so deliberate it stopped Elias's breath, Milo turned his head. Not forward. Not to the side in the idle way of a horse checking the edge of the path for a strange stone. Backward. Over his right shoulder, his neck arching far enough that one large, dark, amber eye was looking directly behind Elias. Looking at the space over Elias's right shoulder. And the eye was wide. Elias had been around horses long enough to know that the eye is where everything lives. The ear tells you what they hear. The body tells you what they feel. But the eye tells you what they know. And what Milo's eye told him in that moment, in the specific quality of its dilation, in the way the whites had appeared on its edges, in the something behind it that had no clinical name but that every person who has ever been in the presence of a truly frightened animal will recognize on a cellular level, was that what Milo was looking at was not a pheasant, was not a branch, was not anything that belonged to the ordinary inventory of a meadow in October. Elias stopped assuming. He said, aloud, easy. The word fell out of him flat and strange, the way your voice sounds wrong when you're alone in a house and a door moves that has no reason to move. Milo did not respond to it. He had already turned his head back to face forward, and now he was speeding up again, more urgently this time, his stride losing its evenness, a jaggedness entering his movement like a static that couldn't be tuned out. Every time Elias applied pressure, the horse would slow for 3 or 4 strides and then drift upward again in speed, as if the pressure were a hand and something behind them were an undertow, and the undertow was stronger. If this feeling, this specific texture of dread that wraps itself around a perfectly ordinary afternoon and will not let go, feels like something you have known in your own body, in your own quiet moments when the world suddenly goes strange and close, you are not alone in that. So many of us carry that particular frequency. We have learned to live alongside it, to ride over it, to fill our hours with enough noise that we can convince ourselves it isn't there. You are part of a quiet family here, a family that knows what it is to feel the weight of something unspoken pressing at your back. If this moment finds you, stay. Like this story, into the circle of people who understand. We walk together, even in the dark. 3 times Milo turned his head. 3 times the wide amber eye looked over Elias's right shoulder with that particular quality of pleading, because that was what it was. Elias understood now. That was the precise word for what he was seeing in the animal's face, pleading. Not fear alone, which is a thing that drives away. Pleading, which is a thing that reaches toward. The horse was begging him, with its eye, to look. To turn around and see what the horse could see and Elias could not. What had apparently been following them at a consistent distance since some point Elias had been too deep in his deliberate blankness to notice. He decided to turn. He shifted his weight. He began the motion, the small rotation of his torso, the gathering of intention toward the right, the direction of Milo's gaze, the direction of the thing the eye kept returning to. He had turned perhaps 40 degrees. The corner of his vision was reaching toward the space behind his shoulder. He was close. He was about to see. Milo screamed. The sound did not belong to anything Elias had ever heard a horse make. He had heard horses cry out in pain, the sharp anguished grunt of a bad landing, the tight squeal of a fight. He had heard horses make sounds that carried real emotion, real loneliness, real distress. But this was not any of those sounds. This was a sound with a human shape in it. A sound that went up and broke at its highest point in a way that the human throat goes up and breaks when the body has run out of language and only the pure frequency of terror remains. And then Milo ran. Not a canter. Not a gallop. Something beyond the categories. A dead, desperate, total flight. Every ounce of his considerable body aimed forward, aimed away, aimed at any distance greater than this one. Elias was standing in the stirrups and hovering over the horse's neck before the first full stride was completed. The reins useless now. There was no conversation to be had, no negotiation, no amount of contact that could reach the animal through what had swallowed him. And the wind was screaming past, and the grass was a blur, and the tree line was lurching toward them at a speed that made the distance between them and it feel simultaneously too short and far too long. He stopped trying to control the horse. There are moments when the only true choice is to become part of the thing that is happening rather than resist it, and this was one of those moments. And something in Elias, something that lived below his deliberate blankness, in the older country of him, recognized that and went still. His hands softened. His body followed the horse. He stopped thinking about the tree line. And in that stillness, in the specific acoustic pocket that opened between the wind and the hoofbeats and the screaming air, he felt it. Cold. Not the cold of October. Not the ambient cold that had been sitting politely in the air all afternoon, the reasonable, seasonal cold of a meadow losing its warmth to a lengthening night. This was cold with a point to it. Cold with direction. Cold that pressed gently in with what could only be described as deliberateness, against the nape of his neck. Against the small exposed stripe of skin between his collar and the base of his skull. The breath. That was what it was. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed every defensive layer he'd spent his adult life constructing. Something was breathing at the back of his neck. Something was close enough that he could feel the temperature of it, or rather the absence of temperature, the vacuum of warmth that the breath carried, against his skin. And the breath was slow, and it was even, and it was not hurried at all. Whatever was behind him was not running. Whatever was behind him was simply there. Had been there. Was keeping pace without effort. And then it spoke to him. Not in words. Not in any language that moves through air and enters the ear and gets processed by the language centers of the brain. It spoke in the way that a smell can speak to you, in the way that the smell of a specific soap or a specific kitchen on a specific afternoon can bypass all your defenses and simply place you, bodily and entirely, somewhere you have not been in years. It spoke in the language of the body, the language that runs older and deeper than the word-using part of the brain, the part that was navigating the world for a very long time before language arrived and announced that it would be handling communication from here on out. What it said was, "You know this." And Elias did. He did not know what was behind him. He still could not say what followed him across that meadow, what had been patient enough to wait until the horse slowed, what had drawn close enough that Milo could feel it before Elias could, what had watched 3 attempts to turn and had waited, what had exhaled its cold, sourceless breath against the nape of his neck in the last seconds before the horse bolted through the tree line and out onto the road and finally slowed to a trembling, lathered halt at the gate of the property. The gate with the rusted iron V worked into its arch, the gate that Elias's father had installed when Elias was 4 years old, the gate that his father had once told him, standing beside it on a morning that existed now only in the fragmentary, poorly lit archive of Elias's earliest memories. "Keep you safe, Eli. These old gates keep what's wandering from wandering in." He sat on the horse for a long time at the gate. Milo was shaking. Elias realized, at some point, that his own hands were shaking too, and that his face was wet in a way that he could not initially account for before he understood that he had been crying, somewhere in the run or in the moments after it, without noticing. He sat with that for a while. He walked the horse to the stable himself, which he didn't usually do, and he checked each of Milo's legs slowly in with more attention than the situation technically required. And he stood in the warm dim of the stable for a long time with his hand flat against the horse's flank, feeling the animal's breathing slow from the ragged irregularity of the run back towards something that resembled peace. He spoke to Milo in a low voice. He said things he could not have repeated 5 minutes later. He stayed until the horse had dropped his head and begun to doze. Then he went inside. The letter was on the table by the back door. He stood in front of it for a long time. He was still in his coat, still in his riding boots, still carrying on his skin the specific temperature of that October meadow and the specific absence of temperature that had pressed, with such awful gentleness, against the back of his neck. He was aware that he was standing at the boundary of something. That whatever was on the other side of this moment, the moment before he opened the envelope, was irreversible. He was aware that this was true of all such moments, that the door you haven't walked through yet is the only door that still opens in both directions, and that the whole particular flavor of what he had felt in the meadow, the followed feeling, the pleading amber eye, the breath that was not a breath, had been preparing him for this. Had been insisting, in the only language it had, that the time for deliberate blankness was finished. He picked up the letter. His father's handwriting on the envelope was shakier than he remembered. Older. The letters had always had a specific authority to them, a firm downward pressure, an insistence. These letters leaned. They trembled slightly at their edges, the way old people's voices tremble not from weakness but from everything they contain. He opened it. The letter was 3 pages. He read it standing, still in his coat, and then he read it again sitting down, and then he sat for a while without reading anything, looking at the far wall where there was a photograph he'd always ignored, his father, young, standing beside a bay mare that looked very much like Clara, in a meadow that looked very much like the one Elias had just ridden out of, and he thought about the fact that his father was dying. The letter said it carefully, in the shaking old handwriting, with the specific care of a person who has thought a long time about how to say a thing they know will be heard by someone who has spent a long time not wanting to hear it. He said he was sorry. He said there were things he hadn't said. He said he thought of the gate, the old iron gate with the V, the gate that keeps what's wandering from wandering in, and he said that he had installed it not to keep Elias safe from outside things but to remind himself, every time he drove through it, that he had something inside worth protecting. That he had not always behaved as a man who believed that. That he was asking, at the end of things, if they might speak. Elias sat in the kitchen until the light outside went from the dark blue of early night to the darker, quieter black of proper night. He sat with the letter on the table in front of him and the photograph on the wall and the memory of the cold breath against the back of his neck in the amber eye that had pleaded with him, 3 times, to turn around and see. He thought about the things we follow without admitting we're following them. The things we allow to pace us across open fields at exactly our speed, never closer than they need to be, never so far that the cold of them doesn't eventually reach us. He thought about the patience of unfinished things. He thought about how long certain conversations can wait, how they will simply fall and step behind you and ride your silence and breathe their cold against your neck until the horse you've been riding bolts, until the animal part of you, the part that has been tracking what the deliberate part refuses to acknowledge, simply takes over and delivers you to the gate. He called his father that night. The phone rang 4 times. His father's voice, when it answered, was the voice from the letter, old in it, trembling at the edges with everything it contained. Elias didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a plan. He said, "I got your letter." A pause. Then his father said, quietly, "I thought you might not call." And Elias said, "I almost didn't." And his father said, "I know." And in that small exchange, in the 3 sentences, in the "I know," in the way 2 people can sometimes fit an entire architecture of grief and relief and time into 6 words, something shifted. Not resolved. Not healed. Those are words for things that are finished, and this was not finished. But it had turned around. Whatever had been pacing behind Elias Vane across that meadow, whether it was the weight of the letter, or the memory of a father's handwriting, or the specific gravity of all the words that hadn't been said across all the years they had practiced not saying them, or something older than any of that, something that lives in the quiet of open land and knows which of us are carrying what and how much longer we can carry it before the horse bolts. It had done what it came to do. It had made in turn. That, finally, is what the icy breath against your neck is. That is what the pleading amber eye is asking you to do. Not to be afraid. Not to run, though sometimes the running is part of it. Sometimes the bolting is the thing that delivers you to the gate, to the right door, at the right moment. It is asking you to stop the deliberate blankness. To stop assuming the sound behind you is a bird in the grass. To accept that the things we leave unopened accumulate weight, and the things we leave unfinished learn to walk, and they are patient in a way that we are not, and they will keep pace with us across every peaceful meadow until the day we finally slow down enough to feel them at our back. The cold was not death. The cold was the cost of the distance he had kept. Milo never showed the fear again. He rode the same meadow path the following October, in the October after that, his ears forward, his stride even, the amber eye relaxed and easy. Elias visited his father that November, in the house with the old iron gate, and they sat in the kitchen for 3 hours and talked about things that had been waiting a very long time to be talked about, and it was imperfect and halting and occasionally almost unbearable, and it was the most important thing Elias Vane had done in 11 years. He framed the photograph from the wall. His father, young, the bay mare, the meadow. He put it on the table in the city apartment where he could see it in the mornings. He stopped keeping his grip so loose that he wasn't really holding on. He stopped keeping it so tight that there was no room for the animal beneath him to tell him what it knew. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, the horsemanship of being a person, that you have to be present enough to feel the ears swivel, and honest enough to know what that means, and brave enough, just brave enough, to turn around. If this ride has reached some quiet, waiting parview, let it rest there. Don't rush past it. Whatever is pacing behind you, whatever letter sits unopened on whatever table, whatever gate you have been driving past without stopping to remember why it was built, it knows where you are. It is not in a hurry. But you are allowed to turn around. You are allowed to call. You are allowed to open the envelope before the horse screams and the cold breath finds the back of your neck. Leave a word in the comments if something here walked with you. Tell us what you carry, or simply that you came, and that you stayed to the end. This is a sanctuary for people who know what it is to feel followed by the weight of their own unfinished things. Subscribe if you'd like to stay in this circle, in return whenever the meadow of your days grows quiet enough that you need someone to ride it with you. We will be here. Patient, and present, and not in any hurry at all.